It's good to see everybody. I always love to come to West Virginia. I'm from West Virginia. And y'all know where war is? Not Mexico, not Juarez. Where war is, that's where I went to high school, down in War. And I graduated by the skin of my teeth from the Rocket Boys School. And the Lord saved me when I was 19. I was just a high school dropout, really. I went in and out of high school playing clubs. I started playing dances and stuff when I was real young and everything that goes with that. And when I was about 17, a guy stuck a New Testament in my hand and dared me to read it. And I'd never read it. I love to read, but I'd never read the Bible. And I read it, all of it. I read it for 2 years. And before I turned 20, I surrendered to the Lord and said, do whatever you want with me. Just don't make me a preacher. And I was serious, and he was too. And anyway, we're here. And my lovely wife's family came over from the Lebanese Civil War in 1976. And she was fortunate enough to move to Tazewell County, Virginia, where we were living, and meet me. And we've been married for over 40 years and have 3 kids and a granddaughter who gets all the attention. So God is good to us. He used us to plant the Calvary Chapel in Princeton, West Virginia. The church in Goodlettsville, Tennessee had sent us out in 2000. We planted that one, and then after 7 years, my pastor asked me if I could come back to Tennessee. We worked with him for 5 years. Then we went down to the city, Nashville, Tennessee, where there was no Calvary Chapel in the metro, in the city proper, and we've been there 12 years. So and we're delighted when a pastor called and asked if I could come up and participate, and I said, I'd love to. And let me tell you something. Paul said in Ephesians that when Jesus ascended on high, that he gave gifts to the church. And one of the gifts that he gave to the church is pastors. And you guys have a gift in your pastor and his family. And always remember that. You know, people are people, right? Our people get frustrated with me. I know they do. We don't pretend they don't. But we love each other, and we're in the grace of God. And your pastor and his family are a gift to your church. And I just want you have a wonderful pastor, a good Bible teacher, a dedicated man, and I'm thankful for him, and I know you all are too. Well, let's turn in our Bibles this morning to 2 Samuel chapter 9. And this is where we're going to be. We're going to tell one of my favorite stories today. It really, really is. I was asked to come to a service in Tennessee where some people were adopting 2 children from their family they were just adopting them into their immediate family legally. And I told this story, and after I told the story, there was a kid that came up to me about 10 years old, and he didn't go to church or anything, and he goes, "Hey, mister, that's a pretty good story." And I thought, well, there you go. I knew I was effective. If a 10-year-old comes up and says, "Hey, mister, that's a pretty good story," then I was successful. So we're in 2 Samuel chapter 9, and we're going to, if you can, and I know not everyone can, but if you could stand with me for the reading of God's Word. We like to do this in our fellowship just out of respect for the Scriptures. It's 2 Samuel chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. Now David said, "Is there still anyone who is left in the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" And there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba. So when they called him to David, the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet." So the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lo-debar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. And then David said, "Mephibosheth," and he answered, "Here is your servant." So David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually." Then he bowed himself and said, "What is your servant, that you should look upon such a dead dog as I?" And the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded to his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. Father, thank you so much for this word. I pray that you will give us the grace today to give you our attention. Keep us free from any apprehensions or any distractions, so that we may hear the voice of your Spirit and not merely the words of a man. And we thank you for all these things in the name of your dear Son, Jesus, who makes all our prayers possible. Amen. You can be seated. Well, we have to backtrack a little bit just to get some background on this story. We know that back in the book of 1 Samuel, that rebellious Israel, they were confused. Moses and Joshua had brought them into the promised land, and after Joshua died, they went through a series of judges, and they were confused, and they went to the Lord and complained, and they begged for an earthly king so they could be like the other nations. Now, the first thing, God never wanted them to be like the other nations. And if you think about it, how did all the other kings come into power back in those days? One way, by the sword. They came in by force. They get a bunch of sons, a big army. They go in and they take whatever they wanted from other people. God never wanted his people to be like that. He wanted to be their king. He wanted to be their leader, to be their ruler, their law. So, but in order to punish these rebellious Israelites, he gave them exactly what they wanted. Let that sink in for a minute. Sometimes when we're rebellious, God will give us exactly what we ask for. And he gave them this terrible king named Saul. Saul was a real loser. He liked to look good in front of the people, but he was weak. He was a coward. He was jealous. By the time we get up to chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, we see that God was so fed up with King Saul that he said, I'm going to get someone else to be the king. So he gets the most obscure, unlikely person, a teenage boy who's out he sends the prophet Samuel to Jesse's house and says, one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king, and I want you to go and anoint him. So Samuel goes and he says, call all your sons in. God has told me one of your sons is going to be the king. And all these sons, and the first one comes in, and man, he's good looking, and he's got all this stuff. And God said, it's not this guy. He's not the one. And he goes down to all these sons, and he says, hey, I'm out of options here. And he says, don't you have anybody else? And he says, well, I got this other one, but you don't want him. He's a musician. No, he didn't say that. He said, you don't want him. He's out in the sheep field keeping the sheep. And notice here that the first mention ever of David, think about this a minute. First mention ever of David is, it says in the old King James, he keepeth the sheep. That's the first thing it ever says about David. He keeps the sheep. What did Jesus say about himself? I am the good shepherd, right? David, we know, God chose him because David was a man after God's own heart. So we know that he was anointed to be king. We know the episode where David fights with the giant and he kills the giant with one blow, right? But it took a while. David, then after killing the giant, he becomes a prince. He marries the king's daughter, and he becomes best friends with the king's son, Jonathan. They were like brothers. They were so close. And this is a key part of the story, is that David has this soulmate, so to speak, in David. And some people try to make it out like that they had some weird gay relationship, but they did not, because he said, your love for me is greater than the love of women. I mean, that his love was loyal. It was steadfast. It was committed, right? Okay, because David didn't always have the best of luck with women, if you go and read the rest of his story, okay? But Jonathan and he were extremely close, okay? They had this deep brotherly friendship. By chapter 20, and I'm just doing this flyover of 1 Samuel, Jonathan's father Saul was crazy with jealousy. He wanted to kill David because David was so popular, more popular than Saul was. Jonathan takes up for David, and Saul even wants to kill Jonathan, okay? And finally David says, I just got to get out of here. I can't take this anymore. I'm leaving. And David was on the run for 20 years before he became king. 20 years. So think about that. If you've been praying about something and you know God has even birthed something in you or shown you, my wife and I started talking about planting a church 25 years before it ever happened. Okay? Finally, we planted a church one day, right? So God can take his time in our lives, and he's got plenty of time, and we need to be patient. But right before David left, and he knew he had to get away from Saul altogether, Jonathan and David swear their loyalty to each other. Now, you would think that Jonathan, the prince, was going to be the next in line to be the king, right? But Jonathan knew he wasn't going to be the king. Jonathan knew David would become the king instead of him. And he says in chapter 20, verse 14, and he asks David, and you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Right? So Jonathan says, look, when you become king, please be kind to my descendants and my household. Okay? Now, short version is God judges Saul. Saul goes into battle and dies as part of God's judgment. The king dies. Loyal Jonathan, faithful Jonathan, he's just like Samwise Gamgee, you know, if you know Lord of the Rings. I mean, he's right there. He's gonna stay right there with him, right? And he stays with his terrible father, his flawed father, and dies alongside his flawed father, okay? So that brings us up to where we are years later. David, 20 years after killing Goliath, in our book here in 2 Samuel 9, David is now the king. And David said, is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Because of the memory of Jonathan. How many of you have had a very, very dear friend in life? Somebody you just are so grateful that you had that person. You feel fortunate to have known them. And maybe even that person has gone on to be with the Lord. It's true with me. My two very, very best friends have gone on to be with the Lord. And I am so grateful that I got to know these guys and have them in my life. And they contributed much to me and made me who I am today. But David knew that God had made him king. Somebody said, I had a friend who was in ministry, and he said, I feel like a turtle on a fence post. You ever see anybody take a turtle and set it up on a fence post just for meanness? That's what we said down in McDowell County, just for meanness, right? They take a flat-bellied turtle and set it on a fence post. Well, a turtle can't go anywhere, right? And my friend said, I'm like that turtle on the fence post. He said, somebody had to put me here. And he said, God put me here. David knew that God had taken him out of taking care of sheep. Anybody here take care of sheep? Down in Tazewell County, we get a lot of sheep, right? They're messy and muddy and nasty, and it's not a whole lot of fun. You think they're so cute and cuddly. They're not. They're really, really not, okay? They're kind of nasty, okay? So here's David out in the field, right? And God, now he's a king. So you'd think, and David knew that God had sought him out personally. God took him from the sheepfold. God called him by name and put him, now he's a king. Now think about it. If you're the king, you can do whatever you want, right? They even say it's good to be king, right? The king can do whatever he wants, okay? So what was David going to do with this great position of power that he has now? Is he going to expand his territory? Is he going to make himself rich? Is he going to crack the whip on people? Is he going to execute vengeance on all of his enemies? No. He said, I want to show kindness to the house of Saul for Jonathan's sake. And it shows a great humility, just like we have a great humble king that came to us and washed feet and touched lepers and heard the case of the widow. David humbled himself and said he wanted to show kindness. He was probably thinking about all the times when his brother-in-law, Jonathan was his brother-in-law, and he, David had married the king's daughter, and they went out and they'd go into battle and they'd fight, and they'd come back and the girls in the street would sing. David was a hero, and they'd sing, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain 10,000s, and David was kind of like a rock star, you know? He was really, really popular. And he was thinking about all those old times before he had to leave town, before Saul went crazy. And he's thinking about Jonathan and the sweet friendship he had, and said, is there anybody that I can show this kindness to? Now, you got to remember that in the ancient world, and even in today, whenever there's a turnover in a government, and we're not talking about a republic or a democracy where there's voting, but when there's like a takeover or a coup, that often the new king would go out and he would just kill all of the descendants of the previous king, so that somebody doesn't jump up and go, I'm the rightful heir. I should be the prince. I should get a bunch of people behind him and take over. So for David to do this really shows the heart of God. Think of how that God condescends to men of low estate. how that Jesus humbled himself to leave glory and walk among us and walk around such a mean place like, first century Israel under the Romans. It wasn't a wonderful world that Jesus came into. It was a mess that Jesus came into. So David here is humbling himself, saying, I want to show kindness to the house of Saul for Jonathan's sake. And there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. So when they had called him to David, the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, At your service. Now this guy was probably scared. He was probably nervous. He's, I'm one of Saul's guys, And, and David says, okay, I'm calling you in. And he's probably said, what does he want? So he humbles himself and he's, I'm at your service. And the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show, notice, the kindness of God? The kindness of God. I don't care what you think about God. Romans 2 said that it is the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. It is the kindness of God. That God forgives sinners. That God knows everything about us, and yet he chooses to be kind to us. One of my favorite verses is in James chapter 1, where it says, mercy rejoices over judgment. God would much rather be merciful to people than he would to drop the hammer on us. God would much rather forgive our sins than to punish us in hell. Mercy rejoices over judgment every time. So he says, I want to show the kindness of God. Now, David had been gone so long away from Saul's house. Maybe he knew this servant Ziba. Maybe he didn't. Okay, maybe he didn't know anything about what was going on here with Saul's family. And he says, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet." Now, David probably didn't know that Jonathan had a son. His best friend had a son, and his son was crippled in his feet. Well, flip over, if you can, flip over to 2 Samuel chapter 4. We're going to see what was happening right when Saul was losing it. Saul was literally losing it in the kingdom. He's about to die in battle, You ever see, everybody, some of you older people did, I know. You saw Gone with the Wind, right? Right, and the plantation's going down and everybody's trying to get out of there, right? Or people are in a war zone and they're just trying to flee. Well, 2 Samuel chapter 4 tells a story that as the kingdom was falling and Jonathan and Saul are out here in the battle, verse 4 says, Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, that they had been killed in battle. And his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. She's trying to get out of there to save her life. She's trying to save a child, a 5-year-old boy, a sweet kid. She's trying to save his life, and she drops him and breaks both of his feet. And it was tragic. And now he's crippled for the rest of his life. And now she's trying to do the right thing. We can't blame her, but she was in a hurry. She's afraid. The king is dead. The boy's father is dead. She's just trying to get out of there, and she drops him and breaks both of his feet. So the king said, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lo-debar. Now, it's really important to look at the meanings of names in the Bible. You ever do that? To see what someone's name means in the Bible? This place, Lo-debar, means a barren place. It literally means not a pasture, useless land. We have a lot of useless land in Tennessee. We have so many rocks down there, and you can't even get potable water off of because it's so shallow down there sometimes. But this was just a not a pasture. Okay, he was living in a place that was not a great place. He's got both his feet are broken. You can probably imagine what kind of life that Mephibosheth lived in this place. Probably a fairly miserable existence, okay? Now, when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, "Mephibosheth," and he answered, "Here is your servant." He's showing humility. He's coming to this king. He doesn't know why the king wants him. He's probably afraid, okay? He probably thinks, look, I'm a nobody. I'm a cripple. I don't have any status. I don't have any wealth. My grandfather is not the king. My father is not the prince. What could this new king, who has been crowned by the whole nation, victorious in battle, famous, sweet psalmist of Israel, what could he possibly want with somebody like me? So David said to him, do not fear. Now, I think the reason David said, do not fear, David was a wise man. He was a king. David knew how to judge people. David knew how to look at someone and kind of see what they were about. He probably saw that this man was afraid, and that's why he said, don't be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan, your father's sake. You see that again? David said, I want to show you kindness. That was his whole goal, was to show kindness to this man who is now a grown man. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Now, I get a little emotional when I think of this story. Here's David. He did not even know that this son existed. Okay? Some of you guys probably know, or maybe even you, have had the surprise, hey, did you know you had a son? No, I didn't. Or somebody calls you up and says, hey, I'm the kid that you gave up for adoption or whatever. And it's a life-changing issue, right? But David calls this man in. I'm assuming he's fairly young at this point. He comes in, and when David saw his face, you have to wonder, did David see Jonathan? Did he look just like his dad? What was David feeling when he thought of his friend that was closer than a brother? And he saw this young man come in, crippled in his feet, helpless, living in a terrible place, probably couldn't do much for himself, probably couldn't work, maybe couldn't get around. We don't know if he had crutches or what, but here he comes, and I wonder if David could just see the image and the resemblance of his friend Jonathan in Mephibosheth's face. I think he did. And I think he was just overcome, saying, I can tell it's you. I can tell. I can see the image in your face. And when God looks at us, no matter where we've been and what kind of barrenness we've been in, he still sees that. We're still made in God's image. We might be messed up. We might be broken and busted and living in a terrible place. But we still bear the image of our Creator. And I believe that David saw this. And that the last thing that Mephibosheth expected to hear were these words of the king that literally brought him from rags to riches with just the words of the king. He said, don't be afraid. I'm going to...
battery pack in the...
I always feel like I'm working at Chick-fil-A when I work one of these.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, so meanwhile, back at David's palace, this guy comes in, and this is probably the last thing he expected to hear. First he says, don't be afraid. I'm going to show you kindness for your father's sake. He was 5 years old. He probably didn't even remember much about his father, who was off fighting wars and trying to cover for his crazy dad. But he said, I'm going to show you kindness for your father's sake, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather. Not only I'm going to be kind to you, I'm not angry with you, I'm not going to kill you, I'm not going to punish you, but I'm going to make you rich. I'm going to give you all this land that belonged to your grandfather, and you will eat at my table continually. At the word of the king, he went from rags to riches. Like that.
Probably blown away. When they called him, can you imagine? I don't know where he was living. I just have an imagination. And I'm thinking, he's living in this terrible place. Here comes the servants of the king. They're probably coming with horses and carts or whatever, and says, hey, are you Mephibosheth? Yeah, the king wants you. And he's like, oh, great. What can the king want? Remember getting called to the principal's office? You ever get called into the supervisor's office? Or the manager's office? Right? And boy, you don't like it, do you, right? Or the pastor wants to see you after church. No, your pastor's nice. He wouldn't do that. But what was Mephibosheth thinking? And yeah, but he comes in, and it's like he's totally blown away. And he says, I'm going to be kind to you. I'm going to make you rich. And you're going to be at my house eating my bread continually at my table. Then he bowed himself, verse 8, and said, what is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? You know, I'm sure that Mephibosheth probably had a pretty hopeless life most of his life. Did other kids make fun of him because of the way he walked? Kids can be mean, can't they? Right? Did they make fun of him because he couldn't play ball? He couldn't run? Maybe even had trouble getting to the bathroom by himself or whatever? Did he ever think he would have anything? That he would ever amount to anything or have any kind of future or any kind of career? Was he ashamed of his family because of Saul's craziness? You know, we know that many of Saul's own servants defected to David, and it said when they defected to David, David was out in the wilderness running from Saul, and Saul's men left Saul and went to David, and it said when they went to David that they were distressed, in debt, and complaining. Listen, there's nothing worse than a broke, stressed out complainer, right? And those men came to David, and David made them into his mighty men. David told those guys, he said, come to me, children, and I will teach you God's ways. And David took those losers that came to him and made them into his mighty men. So Mephibosheth probably didn't have much to be proud of with his family. Maybe he was even grieving that he never knew his family. Maybe some of you never knew your dad, never knew your mom, never knew your family, and it's always bothered you, and it's been something that you've carried around all your life. Maybe even Mephibosheth thought he was cursed at worst, or at best that God was just mad at him, that God was disappointed, and God let this happen. Probably some of us have gone through these kind of things. We have a messed up life. We know it's messed up. We just have to be honest and say, why is my life like this? Is God mad at me? Was he just trying to single me out? Why did this happen? Whatever, we know that he had a very low view of himself and said, what is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? Well, the king David called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants, so he had a lot of guys working for him now, right? And the kings had authority to do that because the kings owned the land, okay? They could just pretty much do what they wanted to. Of course, the Lord had given all the tribes, land when Joshua went in to the promised land and divided it up. And Saul, being part of the tribe of Benjamin, he would have had land that would have been his own. But Ziba says to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's son. Now notice here, Mephibosheth is no longer carrying this stigma and reputation. It was earlier he was called the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul. But now he is as one of the king's sons. It doesn't matter what your reputation is. It doesn't matter what society says about you. It doesn't matter what kind of label people have put on you. It doesn't matter if people say, well, you're just an addict, or he's just this, or she's just that, or they got a record, or what. It doesn't matter, because when we become a new creature and we come to the king's table, now we are as the king's sons. Jesus said, I now call you friends. No longer servants, but I call you friends. We have relationship with him. You know, I like to think about this too. You know, when you sit at the table, you sit at the table, right? You can't see his broken feet. He was covered. They probably had tablecloths like we do. I don't know that they did or didn't, but the fact that his feet were under the king's table, his shame was covered by what God had provided through David. Now, it's so easy for us to look at this story and to see the parallel of our adoption. We're broken. We're in a barren place. We're in a place that's not a pasture. And God seeks us out and says, I want to show you kindness for my son Jesus' sake, because Jesus died for all. And God seeks us out and wants to bring us to his table. We partake of the Lord's Supper, and our shame is covered. Wind this a little bit up, and then I want to go to a psalm that reiterates our story to us. But Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. It says that he dwelt there. He abode there. He stayed there. He remained there. You know, Jesus has called us to abide in him, to live in him. And he was there far, far from the barren pasture that he'd been in. No pasture, the barren place. He was remaining at the king's house. He was still broken. His feet were still broken, but he was blessed far beyond anything that he ever expected. And what did Mephibosheth do to deserve any of this? What did he do to deserve it? Not a thing. Not a thing. David said, I want to show kindness for Jonathan's sake. Because he loved Jonathan, he wanted to show kindness to Mephibosheth. David's kindness had prepared a place for Mephibosheth when he didn't even know he was there. He didn't even realize that this boy existed. Now, Jesus said, and I always like to bring all of our teachings back to Jesus, because Jesus is our model. Jesus is our teacher and our leader and our shepherd and our Lord and our guide and all these things. But Jesus once said, freely you have received, freely give, right? So whatever God has given us, we're supposed to give it to other people, right? What has God given you? Has God been patient with you? Then be patient with other people. Has God been kind to you? Then be kind with other people. Has God been forgiving with you? Then be forgiving with other people. Has God been generous with you? Then be generous with other people. So we know that the Bible clearly tells us that David was a man after God's own heart. So we can see here that as God had dealt with David, now David is dealing graciously with the son of Jonathan. You see that? David had learned God's ways. And I love it when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Walk with me and learn from me. Let me teach you my ways. And we learn the ways of Jesus. And the ways of Jesus are that we take everything he gives us and we give it away. Everything he gives us, we're to give it away. Let's turn, and I know you guys know this so well, some of you don't even have to turn to it, but Psalm 23 is a psalm of David. And I want us to look at the parallels between what David did with Mephibosheth and the psalm that we all know and love so well. Psalm 23 opens up. Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, or I shall not lack. I shall not lack anything. Okay, so what does a shepherd do? A shepherd is a caretaker. A shepherd protects. A shepherd provides. A shepherd leads. Okay? And what had David done for Mephibosheth? He had led him out from no pasture to a greener pasture. He had protected him from whatever future he might have had without David's help. And he provided for him. Mephibosheth shall not want now. He says, you're going to eat at my table continually. Okay? Verse 2 of Psalm 23 says, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. We have already said many times that the name of the place where Mephibosheth had been living was called Not a Pasture. And yet he was led to green pastures. He was led to a place of provision. How many of you are familiar with a little book called A Shepherd Looks at the 23rd Psalm by Philip Keller? Do anybody know that book? That is a tremendous little book. I encourage you to get that. You can do a group study on it. You can read it. We did it with our college students. But this man, Philip Keller, was a sheep farmer. And he took the 23rd Psalm and he studied it from the perspective of a sheep farmer. And he said that sheep will only lie down, they only lie down when they're satisfied with food, when they're not sick, and when they feel safe from their enemies, right? So when it says that God makes us to lie down in green pastures, that means we're at peace, we're at rest, we feel protected and cared for. So David had brought Mephibosheth from a place of no pasture into green pastures to a place where he could be at peace and he could be at rest. Verse 3, he restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. It's interesting that this word restore is the same word that we saw in Hosea 14 yesterday, man. It means to return. God returns my soul. He returns me to the place that I should have been all along. And the word, the Hebrews, the word nephesh for soul, it means the whole person. In the West, we tend to think of a person being body, soul, and spirit. We like to subdivide our person into all these categories. But the Hebrews had a holistic or whole view of the person. When it says your soul, it means all of you. So it says he restores or he returns all of me. He gets me back to where I should have been. He brings me back to that place. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Can you imagine Mephibosheth's difficulty walking at all, walking anywhere, even trying to get around his own home with broken feet, or trying to get out to take care of errands or whatever he had to do? But he says, God will lead us in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Not so we can look good, not so people can be impressed with us. Look what this guy did. Look what this person. No, but look what God did with this person. Look what God did with someone like Mephibosheth. Look what God did with someone like David. Look what God did with someone like Saul of Tarsus or Peter or any of these disciples. But sometimes when God leads us in paths of righteousness, we feel like, but I can't go there, God. How many of you have ever said that to the Lord? He wanted you to do something. You said, but I can't. I can't go there. I can't do that. I'm not gifted enough. I'm not spiritual enough. That's for preachers. That's for missionaries. That's for holy men. I'm too old. I'm too young. I'm too stupid. Or whatever. Or I'm afraid. I can't. And listen, if God ever says, I want you to go here, you can. You can. Everybody, I don't know, up here I'm sure they do it, but down where we live, all the teenagers, they'd say, I can't even. I can't even. We have a little stone on our kitchen sink. We have like a window, and there's a stone, and right in our kitchen sink at our house, and it says, yes, you can. And and when God is leading us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake, let him lead. But in order to let him lead, guess what you have to do? Somebody say it. Follow. Exactly. A lot of people pray about God's will, want to know what God's will is. Then when you find out God's will, it scares them to death. And they don't want to go. He will lead you. But you know what? God's going to lead some people to go to India or wherever. But he's also going to lead some of you to go to your neighbor and ask for forgiveness. Or apologize. Or to take up the slack for something that you should have been doing. He's going to restore your soul and get you back to where you should have been, but you have to walk in the paths of righteousness to get there. Okay, you got to trust him enough to go and do it. Verse 4 of the Psalm 23, he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I'm sure that Mephibosheth had seasons in his life where he didn't know what was going to happen with him, how he was going to end up, what's ever going to come of me. We know here he had a son. He probably thinks, what's ever going to come of my son? Can I provide for my family? What kind of future will they have? But now it had all been turned around. Why? Because, verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. God was providing a table for Mephibosheth the same way that he had provided a table for David. And David was returning the favor by paying it forward to Mephibosheth. You know, some people believe that David wrote this. Remember when anybody remember when Absalom tried to take over the kingdom from David and David had to flee? Well, there was a man who came and brought all kinds of supplies to David and his men in the wilderness. And some people believe that David wrote this when God had provided for him there as he was basically on the run. Okay, but here David had been so gracious to now provide a literal table for Mephibosheth. And you anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. It's a recognition of you accept me, you bless me, I'm abundantly blessed. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. You know, David could have been an enemy to Mephibosheth. He should have said, I'm going to go for that boy because he might try to take the kingdom away from me in a few years. But instead, David provided a table. In love, in kindness, he sought him out for Jonathan's sake. And I think this is one of the sweetest stories in the Bible, and that's why I love it so much, because we see the heart of God in David providing for someone who couldn't help himself. Now listen, there's not one of us can help ourselves. We can't save ourselves. We can't get ourselves to heaven. But God will seek us out, and he'll say, come to me, and I've got a table for you. And you can dwell with me from here on out, and you will be as one of the king's sons. Not your past reputation, not your disabilities or your infirmities, or you go, yeah, but you don't understand, Pastor. You don't understand. I don't have to understand. God understands. And God knows what he can do with you and what he wants to do with you. Now, on the other hand of this, some of you have a Mephibosheth in your life. There's somebody, you need to take this message and you need to go seek them out and show some kindness to that person that's living in a barren place. They need to be able to come to the king's table. Do you realize how many people have never just been invited to come? They would love to come, but they don't know how to get here. They don't know. Don't assume that your neighbors aren't as interested in spiritual things as we are. They hear so much confusion from the internet and the television and movies and books and music that they don't know what to know about God. And we've been given the word of life. We've been given this message to give to people to show them how to get to the king's table and how to leave that barren place that they're in. So if you're a believer today, I want to challenge you, as I challenge myself, to take this message and say, Lord, show me the people that need to find their way to the king's table. Because a lot of people just don't know how to get there. Mephibosheth was not out in the wilderness thinking, boy, I sure would like to get over to David's table. Maybe if I send him a message or something, or I can finagle my way in, maybe I could get there. No, the king himself made the effort to go after Mephibosheth and bring him in. Just like God is reaching out to some of you today, you're in a place and you need to come to the king's table. And you've never come for whatever reason. Maybe your pride, maybe you're angry, maybe your insecurity, I don't know. But the table is open. The table is for you. And I want to ask you today, is there anyone here today that you would say, you know what, I've been tired of living out in this place and I want to come to the king's table with no soft music, with no eyes closed, no heads bowed. Is there anybody here who would just say, I want to go to the king's table? I want Jesus to start taking care of me and providing for me because I can't take care of myself. Is there anybody here? Anybody at all? You want to just say, Lord, I want you to be my Lord and my Master. If this is too awkward for you, then this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to somebody after church and say, I want to talk about what that preacher said. I want to talk about it. Maybe you feel awkward, and I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot or embarrass you, but if you can't do it in church, it's going to be real hard at work tomorrow or in your neighborhood or wherever you got to go, because people here will support you in your decision to follow Christ, okay, and love you and help you. And I remember when I got saved, I was a club musician. Everybody made fun of me. Mom said, "Oh, you'll be back. We all did that God thing. We did that too. You'll be back. You know, we all did that God thing. You'll get over it." I didn't get over it. 40, how many years? 43 years, 44 years. I haven't gotten over it. Because when Jesus does a work in your life, you'll know he's done a work in your life. Okay? So I want to admonish you today. If you know the Lord, take this message. Show kindness to someone for Jesus' sake. Show kindness for Jesus' sake. And if you don't know the Lord, remember, the table is for you. And you're welcome to come. But you have to accept the King's invitation.